When I was a kid, I went to the optometrist once a year. And if you've ever been to the optometrist, what you might recall is the machine where, you put your eyes up and then they have a bunch of different lenses that they're scrolling through, right? And so what do they say to you as they ask you, to evaluate each lens? They go, better or worse? Better or worse, right? And at a certain point, I started to, as a child even, develop an anxiety because I realized that the choices that I made here eventually would affect my prescription for like the next year. So I started to take more time, and they'd be like, better or worse? And I'd be like, just one more time. Just one more time, A or B. And I'd be like, do it one more, and it took me like 5 minutes. And then when I got older, eventually, I had the opportunity to get laser surgery, and I realized that I was now determining my prescription for the rest of my life. And so you can imagine the pressure I had at that appointment. Better or worse? Better or worse? And it took me a really long time to figure it out. So that's just a little bit about my anxieties. But I was thinking about this idea of lenses that we all wear, and particularly in the context of this series that we've been in, the spiritual lenses that we use to gaze out into the world, right, and develop a certain perspective of life. And the hope is that like a pair of eyeglasses, or like a pair of contacts, right, or maybe you wear a monocle, I don't know, you might be really fashionable. But like a lens that we wear on our eyes, that these spiritual frameworks and points of view that we take on, the hope is that they would increase clarity, that they would open up our field of view, right? And so if this is your first time here at Aldea, so glad you're here. My name is Jake. I'm the pastor here. And something that we do as a community when we have these conversations each week is to try to take some time together and really discuss some ways that we might look out at the world, some perspectives, some spiritual lenses that we might adopt in hopes that they help us move and live throughout the world in a more loving and unified way. And so this series that we've been in is one in which we're hoping to reframe the moments in our lives and the things that we look out into the world and are sometimes confused and scared of that make us go, holy shift. And instead, we might reframe and see these things as a holy shift, meaning that as we adopt some different lenses, some different models and frameworks through which we might view reality. And particularly in this series, we've been looking at ways of looking at the world and our own journeys that operate in stages, that we move from one stage to the next. And the hope is that instead of the usual chaos that we experience, thinking about our own lives, and also looking out at a world that is ever-changing, right, that feels chaotic and overwhelming, and instead of just experiencing that fear and that outrage or that chaos and discombobulation, that instead, by adopting some different lenses, we might see a larger journey of movement, of evolution, of growth. And so today's message is called Spiral Dynamics 2.0. Yeah, because last week we began this conversation about one of these frameworks called spiral dynamics. If you were not here last week, don't worry. I have specially had you in mind because we will be catching you up, so you don't have to feel like you're out of your depth at all, right? But essentially what spiral dynamics is it's a way of looking at human developmental psychology, how we as human beings develop in terms of consciousness, in terms of our relationships, but how this happens on a mass scale. So not just what happens as individuals, but how this applies to humanity as a species and how we've been evolving and changing. And one of the ways that this has been practically applied, just to give you an example of how this can actually affect the real world we live in, is that it was used by Nelson Mandela to transition South Africa out of apartheid, which, if you recall, was a 40-year period of institutionalized racism and segregation in South Africa. So this framework was helpful in shifting an entire population into a greater sense of awareness and unity. And still you might wonder, well, what would this have to do with me? How do I apply spiral dynamics in my life? Well, I'll just ask a couple questions. First, and maybe you resonate with these questions, okay? Who here ever has some trouble knowing how to interact with people you disagree with? Anyone? There's a few of you. Okay, thank you for being vulnerable. Who of us here are curious about what some steps we could take for just individual, personal, spiritual growth might be, just in the next season of life? Yeah? Okay, that's good. And who of us here are hopeful, or at least what we would love to see is that humanity is on some kind of positive trajectory, that we are headed in the right direction. At least we're hopeful. At least that is what we would like to see, right? Yeah? Okay. All right, those of you who answered no to that question, I'd love to talk to you and just learn more. I'm so curious, It's called Spiral Dynamics 2.0 because last week we kind of did a 101 sort of overview, and today we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive. And so I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit. There are 6 stages of spiral dynamics. When we talk about stages, as we've been doing throughout the series, this is not an education on how each stage is better than, superior than the stage that comes before it. We are not here to learn about how we are better than anyone else. In fact, spiral dynamics invites us out of a better or worse, either or, us and them mindset, and into a broader view of how we evolve as human beings. So just keep that in mind as we recap. And the recaps are important, right? How many of us know when we're watching our favorite television show and then we have to wait a year for the next season, and then it comes on, and then they do a little 3-minute recap that just gets you up to speed. And you're probably like, I still have no idea what's happening, right? Especially these new TV shows that are so complex. You just got to go back and watch the first season again. But I'm going to do a little recap, and whether or not you were here last week, I hope that this is helpful for you. And so each stage is represented by a color. And we all exhibit all of these stages. They live within us, and they live in humanity, and they've shown up as we've evolved as human beings. So keep that in mind. The first stage is beige, right? And since those of you who are here before, you can help me. Please just go ahead and talk back during this part. I realized as I made this graphic that it looks kind of like a pancake with butter in the middle. So I just couldn't avoid it. But the beige stage, it is the stage of the earliest human beings who occupied this planet, right? And what were they primarily concerned with? Survival, hunters and gatherers, right? Cave men and women, essentially just trying to get through the day. And yet you and I also experience dropping down to this base level of consciousness all the time. Whenever you and I are threatened, whenever you and I are afraid, the adrenaline's coursing through our veins, and it causes us to go into a fight or flight, a survival mode. So essentially, beige not only shows up at the beginning of human history, but it shows up anytime we sort of drop down to our most threatened. And yet, it's important to remember, this isn't a message of good or bad. How many times has beige saved your life, right? Being more survival conscious in moments. And so it's important to remember, we think about these stages in terms of benefits and limitations. Of course, there are some limitations to this stage because we don't want to live our entire lives in survival mode. And so what happens is we move up the spiral into the next stage, which is purple. Purple takes us out of the isolation and survivalism of beige and into community and perhaps into the beginnings of spirituality. And so at purple, particularly in human history, you see the emergence of larger tribes, ritual, tradition. And in the same way, we as human beings, we move into kind of these beginnings of understanding and beginning to contemplate that which is outside of our direct material reality, right? We begin to imagine that there is a spiritual realm, perhaps. Maybe this shows up in our earliest stages as superstition, right? Or maybe it shows up as sort of having this tribal spirituality. But at purple, we are developing and starting to understand a sense of control by interacting with these mysterious forces right? And perhaps petitioning them to act in our favor. But we move up the spiral because ultimately we want to be in more control than just simply waiting for other forces to act on our behalf. And we move into the red stage. And this is the stage of power, both outer power and inner power. See, in history, this shows up as tribes relating to one another, not simply through this shared ritual and spirituality, but there's the advent of tribes beginning to conquer one another, the advent of the warrior king. And yet it also shows up in our own lives, right, where we have these moments and experiences where we need to start to rely on and draw upon our own power. So it can be a really positive thing when you have these experiences where you are disempowered, these seasons where you feel like you have no control of your life, and then you decide to step up, rely on your own confidence, to be courageous. So red is not purely good or purely bad. Of course, it has some severe limitations, because if the center of gravity is power and dominating other people, then of course that essentially turns into what we look back on and see just a history of bloodshed, right? And of war and of conquest. And so as human beings, we moved up the spiral for the most part into blue, a stage of order, a stage of the rules, following the way. And so at this stage, being a good person includes obeying the law, following the rules. So throughout history, after centuries and even millennia of violence and dominating one another, out comes a sense of morality that transcends the individual and includes the group. Things like the Ten Commandments, things like higher laws emerge. And this is very helpful for creating a sense of order among large groups of people. The limitation of blue is that it can be somewhat rigid, right? That when you live your life based on an outdated set of laws, rules, it has a hard time knowing how to adapt as times change, as people continue to evolve and move up the spiral into orange, the stage of human striving and ingenuity. See, about 400 or 500 years ago, we started this shift as humanity out of, things like the Bible being the highest order of the day, or monarchy being the highest order of the day. And we started to move into this stage in which, as a species, we started to value science and technology, and we created things. And this stage is about human striving and ingenuity, right? And so our ability to make things, industry, this became the basis of our world. And yet it also shows up in our lives, right? Like many of us here probably have this experience from at one point in our journey, perhaps basing our life and our entire life's path on something like the Bible, a fixed way of understanding things. And we transitioned into saying, hey, I'm going to create my own life. I'm going to follow my own path, using my own logic, my own reason, my own intelligence. And so orange represents this powerful movement into our own capabilities. But there are also some limitations to orange. Specifically, it is the stage of that rugged individualism that doesn't have a concern and a care for others. And so we move up the spiral into green, the stage of equality and community, right? Because human striving and ingenuity will only take us so far. And then we realize that, man, there are things that matter more than just what we can make, what we can produce. We ask questions like, hey, are others on this planet being cared for? Are all the voices being heard? And yet, as you think about this stage, you probably realize this is still an emerging stage in our world in a lot of ways. This stage of social justice, human rights, animal rights, care for the planet, in many ways is an ongoing conversation. We look out at the world today, we look out at the dialogue and the discourse happening right now in our government, in our world, and we realize that in many ways, our country is sort of locked between orange and green. It's deeply invested in the orange mindset, but there's also a lot of questions of how much are we going to care about the larger planet and the larger ecosystem of life that we are a part of? So this right here is a picture of all these dynamics at play in our world right now. And I know this is a bit overwhelming, so what I want to do is I want to play a little game. And I want to use this game as an opportunity just to check your memory a little bit, to see how we're doing so far. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about a scenario. I'm going to share a scenario with you, and then I would like you to tell me what color, what stage you think this scenario best represents. Can we do that? Okay. So you may have a friend or a loved one who is very serious about a particular sports team. And when it's time to sit down and watch a game of their favorite sports team, they may even be a little superstitious, right? They might say, I need to have the remote control on my right side, I need to have my beer on my left side, and at halftime I need to take a shower, and then that way my team has a better likelihood of winning. Does anyone know anyone like this? Is anyone like this? Okay, there you go, some honesty. What stage do we think this represents? Purple, that's right. A stage of trying to control some mysterious forces using ritual and tradition. Okay, moving forward. It is game night, and someone new got invited to game night, which we don't know how we feel about that. But anyway, there's a new person at game night, and so it's their turn, right? Playing this game, it's their turn, and this new person does something that's not quite part of the rules. They use their turn in a way that, well, technically they're not supposed to do that. No one else at game night calls them on it because they're new, right? But you're thinking, wait a second. You're saying, if they can break the rules, then why doesn't anyone break the rules? And if everyone can break the rules, what is the point of this game at all? I'm not speaking from personal experience whatsoever, but so you call that person out and you say, hey, sorry, you can't do that. And then everyone else at game night glares at you. Again, I've never had this happen in my life. But what do we think? What stage do we think this represents? Blue. Yeah, it's blue. It's we must follow the rules. Okay. This one is I'm going to pull straight from current events. This is a picture taken at Costco about a couple weeks ago. This is the advent of the egg crisis, okay? And I have to zoom in. Poor cashier, right? They do not look happy about this. What stage does this represent? Beige, right? Survival, threat, and how to sense how to protect ourselves. There's a game show called Survivor. How many of us have watched Survivor? Survivor starts as a team sport, essentially. They're broken up into different tribes, okay, and they compete against one another. But by the end of Survivor, there can only be one winner, and that one winner has to be the best, be the strongest, be the most sometimes manipulative. They have to outwit and outlast all of the competition, and it is perhaps the stage that this person needs to adopt in order to be the best above all else. They might need to enter into what stage? Red, that's right. Power, domination. Okay, true story from my life. Last week, and I'm not even proud of this. I don't know. It's a weird story. Last week, I ordered something from Amazon, and it showed up at my house in under 2 hours. I feel weird about it, right? It just happened. I didn't choose it. I didn't choose under 2 hour shipping. It just happened. But we live in a world where this is, for whatever reason, this is possible, right? The infrastructure, the systems exist to make that level of, convenience possible. What in our world are we being seen to make that even possible? What stage? Orange, right? That makes a lot of sense. Okay, the reality is that we all have moments where we operate from each of these stages, or we dip into each of these stages. And the idea is to withhold judgment when others are perhaps more locked into a particular stage, right? Because we understand that the stages are something that, as we go up the spiral, we are evolving through, almost as we ascend through grade school, right? When you went from 3rd grade to 4th grade, you were learning things in a new way. Your understanding opened up, but you didn't look back and you say, Well, I disregard everything that came before in third grade, second grade, or before, right? It's all a stepping stone, a building block of evolution, right? The goal, perhaps, is just not to get held back. Like my junior high bully who got held back 3 years. So when he punched me, I was getting punched by essentially a 20-year-old. True story. But the idea, friends, is to look at the world with a sense of empathy, integration, a holistic understanding of all the dynamics at play. And I think with this cultural moment, this moment that feels unlike anything we've maybe ever faced, I think that this is what it's asking of us, to look at the world with a greater sense of awareness and empathy. And so it's a framework that really helps us ask some questions like, where are we going as a species, as a society? Are we evolving? What would that evolution look like? Last week, after the message, someone came up to me and they said, Jake, could you speak on some of the very real fears that many of us have, that perhaps we are not progressing as a society, but maybe we are regressing, right? And I understand these fears. They are very real, and I want to acknowledge that. When we look at life in a set of stages, we are not sitting here predicting the future. I am not a psychic. Sometimes I wish I was. There's still time. But the point of this is to look at what is showing up currently in our world. What are the energies currently at play? And there is an invitation for all of us to increase our awareness and increase our sensitivity, right? Not just about others, but about what's going on within ourselves. And really, in fact, we can let go of any expectation that, I wish they would just change their thinking. And instead, we can focus on our own journeys and just increasing our own sense of awareness. So friends, it's not a promise that I'm going to give saying, we are for sure going to move in this particular direction or at this certain speed. It's more to say, friends, that I deeply believe that if we can increase our compassion, our empathy, even approaching life and all that's going on with a sense of curiosity, letting go of fear, letting go of judgment, it will create an ease and a sense of peace in our lives. Or, as the Buddhist meditation teacher Jon Kabat-Zinn says, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf, right? Friends, we aren't always in control of what's happening. We're, in fact, rarely, if ever, in control of what's going on in our world, but we can learn to surf. And so last week, we ended on a bit of a cliffhanger, because what I was kind of getting ready to lead into is the fact that there is a major shift at the point that we reached in spiral dynamics. And this shift is the fact that there are actually two more stages. And these two stages represent a profound leap in consciousness, a leap that is spiritual, that is holistic, and that might even ask of us to adopt a sort of mystical lens of the world. And it's these final two stages that are a bit divisive in the spiral dynamics community. You might be thinking, I didn't know there was a spiral dynamics community. Do they have conventions? Yeah, do they have t-shirts? I don't know. But we do understand, we are familiar with the idea of there being some splits in certain communities over some ideas, right? Like the pizza community, there's a split over whether pineapple on pizza technically counts as pizza. In the toilet paper community, there's a split over or under. And so in the spiral dynamics community, there is this split over whether or not we ought to categorize these final two stages, as part of an entirely new way of seeing the world, or what is called the second tier, right? So there is one side of the debate that says there is no need for tiers, that all stages kind of exist in the same framework. But there is this other side, this developing way of approaching things that says that when you transcend into these final two stages, you are actually engaging in a profound leap and shift in the way you approach the world. That to enter into these final two stages is akin to a spiritual awakening, right? How many of us look at the world today and we think what we need is a mass spiritual awakening? And yet I want to demystify that phrase. We can get caught up in that phrase a little bit. I want to demystify and open it up just to say that we all have moments and seasons in our lives where we gain new perspective, we gain some new insights that increase our capacity to love, that increase the ways in which we're able to view the world in a sense of unity, right? A sense of connectedness with our fellow brothers and sisters and beloved others. And so, friends, your awakening could be something that pushed you and pulled you into greater love and understanding. And it can be very easy at times because it is so life-giving, right? Sometimes these insights transform our view and give us such great peace. Sometimes our awakenings can be difficult because we don't know how to make sense of what's happening. We don't know how to integrate it into our lives, to the people that know us. But in many ways, awakening is about letting go of that which isn't serving us, that which isn't true for us anymore, perhaps that which was never true of us. As Eckhart Tolle says, awakening is not changing who you are, but discarding who you are not. I actually have Deepak Chopra as the speaker of that quote on my notes, which means they're both great. So I don't know. You'll have to figure out which one it is. Anyway, I think it's Deepak Chopra, but I get the two confused sometimes. There's a phrase when it comes to spiritual awakening that I love, that once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you taste, you cannot untaste. Friends, once you adopt a new lens, it is very difficult to go back to the old. How many of us have broken a pair of glasses and then you rummage through your drawers to find last year's pair and you put it on and it's the previous prescription and you're like, I used to see through these? This is ridiculous. Or when we all transitioned to HD TVs, and then, you went to your friend's house and they still had a standard definition TV and you're like, I'm sorry, this is not, you can't be living like this. Or the first time you went to a reclining movie theater and then you had to go back to stadium seating and you're like, I need to visit a chiropractor after this. Friends, when your perspective, when your vision of reality opens up, fitting into a smaller box just isn't the direction that we are meant to take, right? And believe me, I've tried and it does not work. So for a lot of us, what we do is we follow this new path out of an us and them mindset, out of a black and white view of the world, and it can be disorienting, sure, but we are also trusting that it is leading us somewhere. And so this idea of the second tier is certainly challenging, especially in our current political climate, when it is so easy for us to have a mindset where these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, right? But the idea here is perhaps there is a destination that lies beyond an us or them mentality. Ken Wilber, who is instrumental in exposing the world to this second tier concept, he's a philosopher. He says this: what's so interesting about the second tier is that it doesn't just see other worldviews, it understands why they exist, what their function is, and how they can be integrated into a greater whole. Friends, it's more than just looking out at the world and saying, okay, I get that there are people who see things differently than me. It's also being curious about how we can bring them in, how everything belongs, how there is a view of the world that is large enough to incorporate all people. Moving forward, first-tier consciousness is locked in either or thinking, believing its worldview is right and others are wrong. Second tier transcends this battle and sees that all perspective has a role to play in evolution. The thing about the first tier is that no matter what stage you occupy, you look at all other stages as being incorrect, right? But at second tier, you see that there is a much larger scope of evolution and everything has its place. The emergence of second tier, he says, is the greatest revolution in human thought, one that moves beyond ideology into functional wisdom. Perhaps it is something that we not just talk about, but we can live out. And so we start this move into the second tier with the yellow stage. This is where we cross over into a new way of seeing that is not disconnected, that is not separate, but that perhaps we are all part of a greater whole. And that as an individual, I might be able to move throughout life with a greater sense of flexibility and a greater sense of flowing through changing circumstances evolving understandings, right? And so as we kind of enter into this first stage of our awakening, we might have some different names that we've used. Some of you have used language like the transition between the first and second halves of life, right? This is something that Carl Jung, Richard Rohr, they talk about. Perhaps we think back to our first message in this series where we talked about the stages of faith, and we looked at the stage 5 that we called the conjunctive stage, a stage where in our faith and spirituality we make more room for paradox, for some things that we have a harder time understanding, mystery, and we can incorporate that into our spirituality. I've even heard the phrase eco-awakening, like a moment in our lives where we discover and realize that we are not just living on the earth, but that we are of the earth. We are part of the earth. Friends, there are many names for this transition. How did you think of your awakening when it came to you? Whatever it was seeing in a new way, seeing the interconnection, right? Not seeing the world in terms of hierarchy, but in terms of these systems and networks of life that are interacting with one another. And sure, there is great complexity that we have a space for at this stage, but instead of being overwhelmed by all that is happening in the world, we start to ask this question: how can I make it better? How can I, using my awareness, the way that I see things, how can I contribute to the arc of evolution, the arc of progress? So what happens is, at Yellow, we start to integrate all the previous stages. We start to learn how to move in and out of them with ease, not limited by them, not stuck in them, but learning to tap into them, to draw upon them as needed. And that might make you the kind of person that is a little hard to pin down. Anyone ever feel like this, right? People are asking you, like, what do you believe? How do you see this situation? And it's hard for you to have a simple answer. I like the way Walt Whitman said it. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Friends, Yellow is a stage where we discover that we as human beings contain multitudes. And so it's not always going to make sense to people who occupy previous stages. And frankly, it's not always going to make sense even to you, right? But as we grow in wisdom, we start to learn to be comfortable even in the uncomfortability of a changing and evolving worldview. As Richard Rohr says, maturity is the ability to live with ambiguity. And so at Yellow, we awaken to a whole new world of possibilities. But every stage, as we've said, has their benefits and their limitations. And one of the limitations of Yellow is that it is lonely. It can be isolating. How many of you stepped into a new way of seeing the world, a spiritual awakening, and then you were like, who do I talk to about this? I speak to so many people, and I am one of these people who came to Aldea, and they felt like it was a breath of fresh air because finally they have people who they can talk to, people who understand, people who've been on a similar journey, because the journey of opening up our spirituality and our worldview can be very isolating at first. But that also continues to move us up the spiral into Turquoise. I know, we're in the Southwest. I know how we feel about Turquoise. So now Turquoise has another meaning for you, okay? Turquoise is the awakening of even more possibilities as we step beyond the individual experience of awakening and evolution, and we begin to enter into a communal and holistic understanding. At this stage, we are focused not just on our own journey, but on the whole, on the integration and interconnection of all things. We have a small group that meets here in Aldea called Oneness. And so how many of you go to Oneness, right? It's become so popular. There are now 2 meetings of Oneness. I love it. But Oneness, it's such a good word to describe what we feel at this stage, that things start to reveal themselves to be interconnected on a deep level. When we had our stages of faith talk, we talked about this idea of universalizing love, a faith of which all people of all backgrounds, all traditions can find their place, an understanding of the world. This is resonant of Turquoise. At Turquoise, we say that all things are connected in a singular living system. And it's in this understanding, it's in this system, it's in this way of seeing that spirituality, science, ecology all find their place in a cohesive whole. I remember 10 years ago when I was first introduced to this idea of spiral dynamics. It was at a workshop by the author Rob Bell, and he rented out this famous LA nightclub called the Viper Room, and that we met there in the daytime, and he was talking about this idea of spiral dynamics, and when he came upon Turquoise, I remember thinking, I would love to know what that's like. I would love to be a part of a community who lived that out. And I'm so honored and excited to say that it didn't even take me a full decade to get there with all of you, that here we are in a community that I believe, oh yeah. And frankly, that has nothing to do with me. That's about so much of the work and care and effort that's been put into this community for decades now. I just got to jump along for the ride. And so I consider myself so honored, right? But I find that what we're doing here, I believe, is of such utmost importance, because in many ways, to live in a community that is in this stage, right? It means to push the very envelope of what humans are capable of, and we do it together, right? And that is so much more valuable than the wisdom of any one singular person or teacher. Thich Nhat Hanh felt this way, and I feel like this quote is very profound in communicating this idea. He says, the next Buddha may not be an individual, but a community. Said another way, philosopher Jan Gapser, enlightenment is not just a personal experience, but a field of collective resonance. Friends, there is a vastness that we see at this stage when we start to really wrap our heads around the interconnectedness of life itself, and it can be very overwhelming. So it's in community that we are centered and grounded, right? And I think what we're going to find as we continue down a journey collectively as humans that we are certainly maybe not fully prepared for, right? But as we're just moving through life and many of the changes that we are trying to flow through, I think what we're going to find is that community is essential. I think we're going to find that community is even more essential than eggs. This week was Valentine's Day, and so this month we think a lot about love, right? And we think about just what does that really mean? Is there a greater view of love than just romantic love? And what I appreciate about spiral dynamics is that love shows up in all stages. Even back down to Beige, we see love, right? Because you would still, give your life to protect someone you love at the stage of Beige. And yet as we move up the spiral, the vision of love just gets larger and larger and larger. And friends, we might not be able to fully comprehend and embody love at the level of Turquoise all the time. But when we have it as a benchmark, as a target, it is incredibly helpful for our lives. When we feel challenged, when we feel discouraged, when we feel empty, we can still remember that our goal is this universe-sized love, right? When we feel disgruntled and confused by politics and we say, well, I can't love those people, or I can't create a community where, those ideas belong. Perhaps we can recognize how we have yet to still grow and learn in our capacity to integrate and to create this level of Turquoise love and community. I'm not claiming that we're all going to be able to fully embody all these characteristics, nor am I even saying that in our lifetime that we're going to see the whole world reach this. But friends, when we have something to point to and we have something to strive for, it gives us a sense of direction and movement and purpose in life. And yet there's some hope. There's some hope. See, social theorists have this idea called the tipping point theory. And the tipping point theory is that if 10% of the people in a given society adopt a certain belief or framework, that it has a massive effect on the other 90%. When 25% adopt this framework, you reach a threshold that they believe is irreversible, right? That you will experience change weighted in that direction. And when you get to 50% or more, that becomes the dominant paradigm. But the point is that it's the leading edge of progress that dictates the change for the rest of the society. And so the hope is that if even 10% of a given collective of people embody a new way of thinking, it can ripple and create massive world change. So friends, the goal is not waiting around until everyone agrees with you or sees what you see. The goal, friends, is to embody your stage, to shine your light, to be who you are in your fullness. As Michael Beckwith says, you don't have to convince people to evolve. You just have to live your truth so fully that it calls to those who are ready. Friends, the invitation of spiral dynamics is not to think of yourself as more evolved than another. It is simply to honor your journey, to honor your growth, and to realize that as you develop, as you awaken, as you evolve, you do so on behalf of the world, that you are calling to those who are ready to join you, right? And so, Aldea, here is my encouragement for us. May you shine your light. May you love boldly and courageously. As poet Wendell Berry says, may you be joyful, though have you considered all the facts. And despite all of the challenges, may we live in this world with our head held high, moving up the spiral into deeper love, deeper unity.